Gonna kick off the event with our first speaker, Alexandre Jacquillat. So he's an associate professor of operation research and statistics at the MIT Sloan School of Management. His research focuses on data-driven decision-making, spanning stochastic optimization, machine learning, and integer optimization. And his research aims to develop scalable algorithms and decision-making tools to support more efficient, equitable, and sustainable operations in transportations and logistics, which is very relevant to our challenge. So be it air traffic management, microtransit in urban mobility, and collaborative logistics. He has a wide range of experience. Before his current position, he was an assistant professor of operations research and public policy at Carnegie Mellon University's Heinz College. He has worked a lot with the governmental organizations in transportation analytics, and he has Master of Science in Applied Mathematics from École Polytechnique, as well as a PhD in Engineering Systems from MIT. Alexandre, thank you for being here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Let me just make sure that everything is okay. You can see my slides. You can hear me well. If not,
Alexandre, we cannot hear you, or we can hear you very
okay. Okay. You still cannot hear me?
No, I think it's
okay.
Try to set up things.
The test was good. Denis, is that, do you know if I can do something here?
Okay, now we can hear you well. So
okay, great. So you can hear me, you can see my slides, all good? Awesome.
Yes, everything is good.
All right, thanks everybody. Thank you so much for the invitation, and most importantly, thanks for putting together this this event. It's a very very important one, obviously, and one that has a lot of impact and applications in Morocco right now and beyond in the future. So so thanks for all of your efforts in terms of organization and participation this weekend. Very important. So actually, in a sense, what I'm going to talk about right now is a continuation to the last question that was asked before, which is now how can we use optimization to improve supply chains in general and disaster response in particular. And this really has to do with the fact that indeed sometimes we have scarce resources in some areas, we have an abundance of resources in other areas, or we have scarce resources at some times, but then more resources at other times. And how can we use these resources and constraints in order to allocate resources more efficiently and more effectively in a way that will have the strongest benefits, right? So that's more or less what optimization does. And a lot of my own work deals with emerging problems in supply chains and develop methods and algorithms in order to address those. So logistics and supply chains are facing a lot of significant challenges. Some of them are actually becoming more and more important by the day. So on the one hand, we have rising customer expectations, right? We are now used to having a car whenever we need it. We are now even used to same-day deliveries, next-day deliveries sometimes, even same-hour deliveries. But at the same time, we're evolving in a world where sustainability targets are becoming increasingly pressing, and this is obviously creating a lot of challenges in terms of how to meet this need for faster and faster speed while mitigating actually the footprint of the sector. We're talking about a sector that is responsible for 25 to 27% of global greenhouse gas emissions, right? So obviously this is an important thing. So we have a few projects here in terms of electrified trucks, for example, or leveraging emerging marketplaces for more consolidations, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit. We're evolving in a world that is very prone to disruptions and disasters. This is really the topic of what is bringing us together today. I haven't really worked on applications with earthquakes. I have worked a little bit on the response to wildfire seasons, and I'm going to talk about that as well. And finally, we're also looking at an environment where the social dimension is very important. These supply chains are operated by human operators, drivers, for example, or fire managers and fire crews, and these have very important considerations when it comes to lifestyle, human resource requirements, human resource regulations. And so we need to think about this as well, right? So we have an equity question, we have an efficiency question, we have an environmental question, so we have a resilience question. But on the bright side, we have a lot of opportunities that come from the field. And when we another question that was asked before is how can we use these new vehicles, the drones, the connected vehicles, the automation, and at the same time all of the marketplaces and the platforms that are creating more new business models based on digitization. And the big question that I'm asking in this research is, okay, so how can we leverage these things in order to improve logistics systems? And what we find time and time again is that unfortunately these innovations are helping, but they're not necessarily a silver bullet. They're not a magical wand by themselves, but we need to develop dedicated analytics and dedicated optimization methods to embed them into how we operate logistics systems. And so I'm going to have one example of that in this talk. So this is an overview of our work in my group at MIT. So I used to do some work in aviation. We do a lot of work in microtransit right now. But what I'm going to focus on today is the decarbonization of logistics systems and disaster response. So when I talk about disaster response here, I do not talk about monitoring at all, but I talk about what comes after that. Right. So assume that you have an AI system that is able to detect wildfires, that is able to predict what is a dangerous versus a non-dangerous wildfire. Then the question is, with the crews that you have, with the vehicles that you have, with the resources that you have, how can you actually effectively respond to this threat? And so this is really going back to the subsequent downstream phase of AI, which is the optimization, the resource allocation part. Okay, so I'm just going to talk briefly about two papers. I'm more than happy to talk about details offline. I want to keep the presentation a little bit more high level than I would usually, given that you have way more important things to do this weekend, and also because of the diversity of backgrounds here. But I want to give you a flavor of what optimization can do in this field. So in this paper, we're looking at a new model in logistics systems, which is the model of relay. So the way typically logistics works is that you will have a shipment that goes from Montreal to Los Angeles. You will have a driver that starts driving in Montreal, goes all the way to Los Angeles. And then when they arrive around Los Angeles, they will get a call saying, oh, we actually have another shipment from Seattle to Toronto. So you go empty from Los Angeles to Seattle, you go all the way to Toronto. And then once you arrive in Toronto, you will have a Chicago to Boston. So you go empty to Chicago, you go to Boston, and then you've been on the road for 3 or 4 weeks. You get a call, you go back to Montreal to spend 1 week with your family, and then you start over. So the lifestyle is very, is very particular to say the least. And so what some of the companies have been experimenting with is a system of relay. So instead of doing Montreal to Los Angeles, you will actually do Montreal to, let's say, Toronto. Then you will drop the truckload in Toronto for another driver to take the relay from Toronto to Chicago, and so on and so forth, all the way to Los Angeles. But then when you are in Toronto, then you're going to hopefully find another shipment in the other direction to go from Toronto back to Montreal. And the motto of the company is therefore making trucking a day job, so you can come back to your house the same day or the next day. What's important also is that the reverse shipment doesn't have to be Los Angeles to Montreal. It can be Vancouver to Montreal. And then once you're in Toronto, you can just take it in the same way. So the question is, how can we coordinate all of these movements, orders, shipments, drivers, and vehicles in this network? Right, so this is like a representation of what we're doing. We have a bunch of drivers that are taking a shipment from origin to destination, and then the drivers will come back and hopefully take another shipment back. So what the paper does is developing an optimization model for this. So I'm going to focus perhaps a little bit more on that. The problem is that these optimization models can only solve problems that are that big, but the world looks that big. So now we are developing bigger algorithms. I mean, new algorithms kind of enhance the scalability of these models. And so in this case, it's based on an algorithm called multi-arc generation. So we're showing that we can actually solve large-scale problems. And then what I'm going to show is some results saying that some of these innovations can actually have win-win-win outcomes on logistics. So more efficient operations, more equitable lifestyle for drivers, and environmental benefits. So for those of you who are familiar with the vehicle routing literature or the pickup and delivery literature, what vehicle routing does really is assigning vehicles to orders. So when you have Xij equal 1, when you go from I to J, you're basically bundling orders together. But you don't care what's going on within an order, right? You just assume that from Montreal to Los Angeles, you take the shortest path, and then you do Seattle to Toronto and so on. What we have to do here is that we have to double click between what's between Montreal and Los Angeles. So we have to optimize at a much more granular modular structure at the segment level between Montreal or Toronto. But I get to choose that. I get to choose whether you do Montreal, Toronto, or whether you do Montreal, Pittsburgh, or whether you do Montreal, New York, and so on and so forth, right? So you choose the path in order to create consolidation in your network. And at the same time, I need to assign my drivers because the drivers do not follow the truckload. So now you have a multi-commodity structure here. So we model the problem in a time-space network. So in this network, every node represents a time and location pair. So here you have an order that moves from location 4 to location 3, stays idle, and then moves from location 3 to location 1. And then here you will have a driver that will do the first segment, and then another driver that will do another segment. So you have a lot of these networks, and they need to be coupled together because if I want to move an order, I need to have a driver that does the same thing. So this is the overview of the formulation. We're minimizing operating costs and delivery times subject to flow balance constraints to make sure that we're not breaking the laws of physics. If you arrive in Toronto, you're not leaving from Houston. Then we have a bunch of human resource requirements that we need to take care of, meaning drivers have to come back to home every other day. And then we have coupling constraints that I was talking about. Whenever an order moves, you need to have the drivers that do the same thing. So I'm going to go a little bit briefly over the next few slides in the interest of time because I want to keep things a little bit high level. But for the HR requirements, we have a new model representation where we're not assigning drivers to movements, to arcs from, let's say, Boston to Toronto, but we are actually assigning drivers to journeys. So, for example, like the Montreal, Toronto, Toronto, Montreal, back home, that's a journey. Or Montreal, Toronto, Toronto, Boston, Boston, Montreal, that would be a journey. Right? And so that type of new variables can actually give us a much tighter formulation with much better scalability. But nonetheless, the problem remains very complicated. We have millions of binary variables and constraints. So maybe this is the most important slide. So what can we do? Number one, we can actually give the model to a solver, and then the solver will be able to solve, let's say, up to hundreds of thousands of variables, but not millions. We can do a heuristic, saying, well, if you have a shipment that goes from Montreal to Vancouver, you're never going to need to go in Florida, right? So you're gonna do a lot of variable reduction that way. It's hard to do that exactly. It's hard to get a high quality solution, but it's doable. And then you have other methods based on column generation where you're going to build a model iteratively. And so what we do in this paper is that we actually build the network iteratively by basically iterating between the master problem and the subproblem. The difference with traditional column generation is that we do that on a polynomial formulation and not on an exponentially sized path-based formulation. Again, if you have optimization aficionado in the room, I'm more than happy to talk about details offline, but I'm going to skip the details for now. So the the main upshot here is that we can solve problems that we couldn't solve before with much better solutions than the heuristics I was considering before. So you can go much faster, like you have a times 5 to 10 speed up for medium-sized problems. But for the large-scale problems, you can actually derive solutions where you couldn't with baseline methods. So it's not just an academic game; it has like real-world significance here. And so the final question that I wanted to answer is it worth it? So the first thing that we actually thought of before starting this research is to say, well, it's what I'm calling here orders then drivers heuristic, meaning I know how to operate a logistic systems without relay. So let's optimize that. And then you take the solution and then you add the relay capabilities on top. And we are improving that solution by 15 to 20%, which is obviously very significant. And to me, this is and actually we do more than that because we actually get a Pareto improvement. We deliver order faster with fewer miles and with lower delay. And so basically what's going on here is that that goes back to my earlier point that the innovations are not silver bullets by themselves, but we need to rethink how we operate. We need to rethink what type of service we're providing, where and when we are actually allocating resources in order to make the best use of the connected technologies, of the electric technologies, of the marketplaces, of the platforms, of digital solutions, and so on. And in that case, what that means is that we need to take short detours and delays strategically in order to create consolidation opportunities for the driver in Toronto to actually come back to Montreal full and not empty. And if you do that well, then you get the win-win-win outcomes I was talking about. As compared to point, drivers are way less away from home by design because they come back home every other day. Your shipments are actually faster because between Montreal and Los Angeles, drivers would have to sleep, but orders don't sleep. So I can have a day shift, you have a night shift. I have a day shift, you have a night shift, and the shipment is faster. And thanks to the consolidation I was talking about, you have less empty miles. And that can make a dent toward mitigating the environmental footprint of logistics systems. And finally, in the spirit of talking about disaster response, I wanted to briefly mention some ongoing work that we have on wildfire response. So big disclaimer, everything here is preliminary. But basically, as you know, and unfortunately, as you're well aware, if you're living in Quebec, wildfire seasons are worsening. So every year we feel that it's a record year, and next year is going to be a record year in some areas. And so this is obviously very difficult to manage, to suppress, to respond to. And actually, something that is perhaps less well known is that firefighter resources are very restricted. And obviously, we're also talking about a profession that has significant health hazards, so you cannot do anything. And the chief of the U.S. Forest Service actually had this important quote where basically sometimes they say that they are in triage mode. Think about a hospital in the midst of COVID. You cannot treat all the patients, and you have to do some triaging. It's kind of the same thing for wildfires here. So what we do is we build a model where we're basically tracking two things. One is the crews, like where they're going, and at some point they have to rest, and the fires. And so from a vehicle routing standpoint, you have a problem where your customers become bigger if you don't serve them, right? The fires grow while unattended. So we have a model that essentially optimizes the fire routes on the fire suppression plans on the one hand, and the crew routes on the other hand. So subject to fire dynamics on the one hand, but subject to HR regulations on the other hand. And then you have the linking constraints that will basically bring them together. So again, I don't want to go too much into details, but once you have all of these plans for crews, all of these plans for fires, then you need to actually solve the problem. It can become very complicated. So we actually did we actually develop crew plans and fire plans on the fly via a double column generation structure. And then you're using duality in order to incorporate local information to link the two subproblems. Again, I'm going to skip some of the details here, but the point is that we can, off-the-shelf methodologies can actually only solve problems that are very small scale with like up to 3 fires and 10 crews. When the problem becomes bigger and bigger, this actually really doesn't scale, and so you need to do something else. And our solutions can produce, our methodology can produce solution in seconds to minutes with performance guarantees. And so we're collaborating with the US Forest Service in order to test this based on historical data. This is like a snapshot of the type of solutions that we're providing to them. In this case, we have a solution where we can get a Pareto improvement in terms of reducing fatigue for the crews with less crew miles traveled and less violations to HR requirements, which is a 14-day shift with rest after that. And we do all of that with the same impact in terms of fire. So we find a better way to perform the same fire suppression plan. What we are currently trying to do is to embed the endogeneity of the fire dynamics into the problem. And we have the optimization for that. What we're trying to build is the AI, because we need to learn the fire dynamics from the historical data. But it's not only a prediction problem, because it's a causal inference problem, because we need to also learn the treatment effect of past fire suppression efforts. So that makes it a little bit more complicated, and so this is ongoing work. I just want to leave with this slide that I had before, but by basically shifting from challenges to opportunities. The various things that I mentioned here today show that in response to rising customer expectations, we can actually use optimization methods to reduce lead and wait times. In response to sustainability targets, we can actually use optimization methods to reduce the environmental footprint of the logistics and supply chain systems. In response to the significant supply shortages that we're facing, we can actually use optimization to improve the lifestyle for operators. Again, less time away from home for my truck drivers, and less violations to health-inspired regulations for my fire operators. And all of this can be applied to design robust and resilient response to natural disasters. I showed an example about wildfires based on ongoing work, and the floor is yours for earthquake response. Again, thank you so much for the invitation and for organizing this event. And obviously, I'm happy to stick around for a few questions.
Thank you so much, Alexandre, for this very cool presentation. So we're going to take questions first from the audience and then online.
So you talked about like relay for trucks, and you said it would be great for the environment because it would like lessen the number of miles. But did the study take into account the impact it would have on traffic jams and pollution levels in big cities, where you would likely have a great concentration of trucks to be sure there would be another one to take home?
Yeah, that's a good question. This particular business model is really focused on long-haul trucking. So your concentration is at speed stops that are like along highways. So that's not as much of a concern for this particular case study. There is actually a question of how to do that for cities. I think that we can turn your question into an opportunity in the following way. The way a lot of logistics providers are trying to do that is by developing a multi-echelon delivery systems for first mile and last mile. I don't work in that area as much, but you can take the same concept, and actually the opportunity would be like, instead of having like a big truck that will actually do door to door in a city, you can actually have and go back to the depot that is at the outskirts and come back and basically increase traffic jam and pollution. You can actually have these types of like relay points that would be at the boundary of the city, so to speak. And then you actually, instead of going downtown, you just go there, and then you can have smaller vehicles, little vans or cars or scooters or things like that, that will then go from the outskirts to the city to downtown. So this is like taking this model to go one step further for first mile, last mile. There are a few papers that consider that. There are a few companies that do that. And I think that this is where this is headed if you want to take that environmental opportunity to the next level in cities.
Okay, thanks.
Any other question? No? Do we have questions online? Okay, perfect. So I think that was all for the questions. Alexandre, thank you again.
Thank you.
Okay, so now we're gonna follow up with our next speaker. One second. Professor Robin Murphy.